I pray that at this Advent season, during this Advent season, that you are contemplating the greatness of this one who came to enter into his own creation, the purpose of living under the very law he himself had established in perfect righteousness and holiness in order that he might then go to the cross and establish that righteousness over us. And I hope that this has been a season for you in which all of the details of life have not swallowed up the ability to take a moment and consider those things day by day and as much as is possible. I want to continue with our examination of 1 Timothy chapter 3. And somewhat in the light of Advent, in the sense that this is not directly related and seems to be almost completely opposite, in fact, of Advent itself, but it is because of the coming of this one that we are able to be a part of the church, for he is the one who established it by his own blood and through his Spirit and by his word. And so even though this looks utterly detached from Advent, it is not. It is a continuing thought along a long line of thought that reaches all the way from the cradle of Bethlehem even to the church of our day. And so we continue with our look at 1 Timothy. And we start this morning into chapter 3. We really started into it last Sunday with sort of an overview of the concept of eldership. And if you did not have an opportunity to hear that introductory sermon, I would encourage you to go back to the website and pick it up and listen to it, because it will help make some sense out of where we're going with this. But this morning I want to get to the details of the chapter itself. Before we do that, of course, though, it's my common practice to sort of step back and give you the larger picture of where we are at. The book of Timothy is easy to outline. The first chapter gives us Paul's first great indicative, or his primary indicative, which is that the church is made up of and defined by its very doctrinal boundaries. Anything outside of the apostolic or orthodox message of the gospel threatens to undo it. And the church at Ephesus was struggling with those who were teaching what was false. And so Paul writes to Timothy to say, you need to get this church back on track. And then in chapter 2, he gives Timothy the first set of instructions on how to do that, specifically noting that the first thing to do is for the church to become a praying body, praying for the opportunity to proclaim the gospel to every class of people, without losing track of the role of each person in the church, of all of us who make up the church, as we explore the role that God has for us in this body, that we are working together to the common goal of advancing the cause of Christ. And prayer is a means by which we accomplish that as we consider the great work of the church. So as we get into chapter 3, then, Paul is simply extending the point that he's making in chapter 2, which is, as we explore the various roles in the church regarding how we are to advance this cause, one of those roles is the role of elder in the church. One of those is the role of an individual set aside by God through Christ, by his Spirit, to take up the mantle of leadership and to guide and direct this spiritual formation, this body of believers. And it makes logical sense, doesn't it, that if in chapter 1 Paul is talking about a church that's having trouble with people teaching what is false, that he would eventually get to a point of talking about what it means to be part of a group that teaches what is true. So chapter 3 is the logical continuing thought of Paul in that sense. All right, so let me read a few verses of this chapter for you that we'll be focusing on this morning. 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 1. The saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to the office of overseer, or elder, or bishop in some translations, he desires a noble task. Therefore, an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not a drunkard, not violent, not gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. He must manage his own household well, with all dignity, keeping his children submissive. For if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he care for God's church. We'll stop there, although we won't get anywhere near the end of that sentence. First, Paul starts by giving what I think is an extraordinary statement. It's kind of overlooked. A lot of people get to the qualifications of elders and immediately start diving into the individual things. But I think this first verse is key. When Paul says, the saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a noble task. Now, you remember that phrase, the saying is trustworthy? We've already seen that once before in this book. In fact, back in chapter 1 and verse 15, Paul said the same words. And what he means when he says the saying is trustworthy is what he's saying is, listen, this is something important. Pay attention. This is something you need to hear. This is something you need to consider. This is profound, is another way of saying it. The saying is trustworthy. What I'm about to say to you is something you really need to listen to and to hear. Okay. So Paul is writing these words, you remember, to Timothy. So he's saying to Timothy, Timothy, I want you to hear this. And because he's also writing to the church through Timothy, he's saying to the church, hey church, listen to this. Here's what I want you to hear. And he goes on to say, if anyone aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a noble task. Now let me draw for you 3 observations from this verse that I think are automatic as you look at it. Number 1, first observation, it is okay to aspire to this position in the church. I mean, Paul himself says, if anyone aspires to the office, he desires a noble task. He's obviously saying then that it is okay to aspire to this position. God will put within some men not only the gifts required to be an elder, the gifts of eldership, and the qualifications that go with it, as we'll see in the words below, but also a passion to do the job, to take on the responsibility. I've always been convinced that the gifts of the Spirit, the actual abilities to accomplish something, are always given with the passion, the desire to do it. I can't imagine the Spirit of God coming along and saying, I'm going to gift Joe here to do this or that, and then to just sort of leave Joe in a position of, well, I don't really want to do that. I mean, I'm really good at it, but I don't really want to do that. I can't imagine that the Spirit of God would do that. I'm convinced that when you look particularly at other passages where it speaks of such things like spiritual gifts, such as 1 Corinthians 12, 13, and 14, there's this clear picture that the Spirit of God not only comes upon someone to give them ability, but He also places within them a passion to do so. I've always been, from a ministerial perspective, I've always been convinced that the only people that should be serving in some sort of ministerial role in the church, no matter what it is, should be doing it only if they have a passion for it. I mean, how many times have we seen people say, yeah, all right, I'll work in the nursery. I don't want to work in the nursery, but I'll work in the nursery. I mean, okay, put me on the rotation. And find them doing the job or not doing the job at all. Doing the job poorly or not doing the job at all. What's the point of that? I mean, they may be perfectly capable of taking care of babies, but they don't have a passion for it. Personally, if I were not doing this particular role, I would actually enjoy working in the nursery, but it would only be with the babies that are the tiniest in the church. That's where my passion would lie. And that's just how it works. God gives gifts which include the passion to accomplish it. So I believe that what Paul is saying here is that, yes, there will be men in the congregation who will have these qualifications and giftings, and then God will place upon them a passion to do that. And the passion is what will drive them to do the job well over time. So my first observation is it's okay to aspire to this position in the church, which leads to a second observation. It is not okay to desire the office of elder just because it is good to be in power. That would be the wrong reason. That would not be the passion that I'm talking about. It is not okay. Eldership is, as Paul says, a noble task. that requires all of the characteristics Paul will go on to list. So it's not as though any individual should say, I want to do this. I want to be a pastor or an elder because, well, I'm going to get to park in all the best spots. People are going to genuflect when I walk by. And I'm going to be treated like a god. Well, it would be the utterly wrong reason to do it. Now, that would be not a passion at all, would it? That would be something else. The fact of the matter is that it's okay to aspire to it, but it's not okay to go to the office of elder just as because it's good to be in power. And the bottom line is that as we're addressing the remaining verses in this section, it's going to sweep away any of these concepts from those who would aspire to the office of power. And then my third observation, and this would be a larger observation, it is not okay for the eldership to be made up only of an inner circle of men, clutching their power and holding at bay some who God may lead into that role. We must never assume that the eldership is a closed office, and if you want to get in, we must be always, as a group of men, ready to embrace those that God will raise up to be involved in that. Now, you remember from last week I said that the reason why these verses are important to you, some of you may say, well, I'll never aspire to be an elder, and according to Paul, I'm not qualified. Why would any of us care about this? And the answer would be because you should be, as a congregation, demanding that these three observations be true about a church, our church, this church, the church that we belong to. We must be those who are willing to say, listen, there will be men who aspire to this and is good for that. We must hold those elders accountable to that, looking for those who would aspire and are gifted and given the passion to do so. Paul thinks of this office as a noble office, but he does not say it is reserved for some special class of men with some social class or whatever, economic class or whatever, but rather it is an office that is established by the very workings of the Spirit of God in individuals to that position. And that's important for us to consider. So then Paul goes, notice verse 2, the very first word of verse 2, therefore. Okay, means he's about to draw a conclusion. All right, if it's true that men aspire to this, and it's okay for them to do so, and not because they're pursuing power, but because they have a desire to see the Church of Jesus Christ accomplish its mission, then if that's true, then, therefore, here's what must be true. Here must be true about them. Notice the connection. Aspiring to aspiring to an office is one thing, but being qualified to it belongs as a connection to it. So in verse 2 then, Paul says, therefore an overseer must be above reproach. At least that's how it's translated in the ESV. Other translations use the word blameless at times. But the problem with the word blameless is that it can imply perfection. Can it? Not. Blameless, without blame, meaning someone can be perfect. Paul's not speaking of that. What Paul means here, this word that he's using, and it's a slightly different word that he uses in the book of Titus to describe this office, but it's having the same basic definition, is that the person who aspires to this office must be free from accusation. He must have a good reputation. So it's not as though Paul is saying that this is a sinless person, because there's no such thing. So if above reproach meant choose men who are perfect, sinless, there would be no elders, ever. Okay, so obviously Paul cannot be meaning that. What he means by this term blameless or above reproach is that this is a man of such good reputation that his character flaws and sins, albeit many, do not cast any sort of disparagement upon himself, his position, his message, or the church in general. Meaning that, yes, he's flawed and everybody knows it. His flaws are obvious. His flaws are clear. And yes, he's a sinful man who needs to repent of his sin on a regular basis and seek the power of the Holy Spirit to walk blamelessly. But those flaws do not create in him a disparagement upon himself or upon his position as an elder or his message of the gospel or the church itself. In other words, people see him as trustworthy and reliable. His public persona is one of good character. He's a man of good character. Men look at him and say, yes, he's flawed, he has sinfulness, he struggles with these things, but he's still trustworthy and reliable. Remember, if Paul was considering blamelessness, meaning sinlessness, then he himself would be disqualified as an apostle. He admits in Romans 7, does he not, that he struggles with sin. He says, the very things I do not wish to do, the very things I do not wish to do, I do. So he admits that he's a sinner. So if he's speaking of this in the sense of perfection, sinless perfection, obviously he himself would be disqualified. No, he sees the role of elder as a role in which people see him as trustworthy and reliable. People see no contradiction between his life and his message. He walks the walk. He talks the talk, yes, but he walks the walk. People see him as a leader and willingly follow his example. He is not a hypocrite. People don't look at him and say, well, he says one thing and does another. But rather, he demonstrates by virtue of his reputation and his character that he can be followed by example. And people see him as one who builds up the church rather than making it the object of scorn. The reputation of the church does not suffer because of the reputation of the man. How many churches struggle with their reputation in the community in which they live because of the reputation of the man who's preaching in the church or acting as an elder? That's a danger, isn't it? Because here's what can happen. People out there who do not know the gospel of Christ, they do know hypocrisy when they see it. They do understand this. And they can look at the church and say, well, you say that people can come to Christ and find fulfillment in him and find satisfaction in what he accomplished. They can find forgiveness of sin. They can find Christ being able to satisfy God, and yet they flaunt their own sinfulness in front of the world. I don't get it. It doesn't make sense to me. And the unbeliever has every right to reject the gospel that is preached by the hypocrite. Every right. And so God says, the reputation of the church cannot suffer because of the reputation of the man. Now, let me point out something you may not have considered. Unregenerate men are virtually incapable of knowing the difference between a good reputation and a bad one. Unregenerate men are virtually incapable of knowing the difference between a good reputation and a bad one. And I think we live in a society in which it's almost impossible today to figure out the difference between a good reputation and a bad one. Remember, unregenerate men love their sin. They love their sin and they encourage others to sin as they do. Therefore, they have a very difficult time judging the character of others. They have a very difficult time determining who is good and upright and worthy to be followed and who is not. Probably one of the greatest revealers of human nature in modern times is Twitter. This thing was invented, I think, for the express purpose of revealing the depravity of men. I think it is. I really do. I think it's what it's designed for. I think if you are on Twitter and participating in Twitter, you are participating in a marketplace in which it is nearly impossible to distinguish between who has a good character and who doesn't, because it's impossible to express who you really are in 160 characters, or however many characters it is now. I don't even know. I'm not on Twitter. In fact, when I first saw it come out, my first reaction was, no. However, for those who are born again and have the Spirit, that Spirit will act as a witness in them. 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, Paul says these words, "For you remember, brothers, our labor and toil." This is Paul speaking to his brothers there at Corinth. "You remember our labor and toil. We worked night and day, that we might not be a burden to any of you, while we proclaim to you the gospel of God. You are witnesses, and God also, how holy and righteous and blameless was our conduct towards you believers." So Paul is not making the claim here that he was perfect and sinless in their sight. What is he making a claim? What we did, the reputation that we had, and the focus we had on the gospel was not brought low by our own failures. God is our witness. You are our witness. Thus, the primary arbiters of who qualifies in this way belongs to the church. It is the congregation, it is the people of God gathered together who ultimately will look upon a man and ascertain, is this man above reproach? Does this man lead according to a righteous standard? We do not, in other words, we do not establish eldership on the basis of those who have a good reputation in the marketplace. We establish the office on the basis of who has a good reputation in the church, with the gospel. That's where it counts. That's where it counts. An elder must be a man of impeccable reputation, particularly within the church. Particularly within the church. A man of impeccable reputation, because Paul, I think, starts here for this very reason. It is the church herself that is on the line in 1 Timothy. Notice, chapter 1, what's the issue? There's a church that's in danger of no longer being a church because it's not teaching what is orthodox, it's not holding to the apostolic gospel. And so when Paul gets here to chapter 3, what he is saying is, listen, this issue is so important that you must put men who are of impeccable reputation, because the reputation of the church herself is at stake here. And I'm convinced that this is one of the reasons why Paul would insist that the eldership be a plurality of men. Because there's reputation in plurality. There's reputation in plurality. You put just one man in a church and you give him the total responsibility of being an elder, there's a much more likelihood that that man will fall than if you have multiple men upholding one another as iron sharpens iron. But then, he says, he must not only be above reproach, but he must be the husband of one wife. Now, the underlying Greek phrase here is extraordinarily difficult to translate from Greek to English. The nouns for husband and wife are words which can also mean man and woman. Now, this is why this phrase is difficult. Because you could take the word husband and the word wife, and you'll find that there actually can mean man and woman. The underlying word for husband here, anir, occurs 214 times in the New Testament. It's translated man, or in the plural men, 138 of those times. Husband, 53 times. It's not the primary word for the male gender in the New Testament. That word is anthropos. That's a different word. But it is part of how this Greek language works, in that some words, like in English, can have different meanings depending on context. Context always tells us which way we're going. For example, over in Matthew chapter 1 and verse 16, which I think Brett read earlier, could be rendered Joseph, the man of Mary, rather than the husband. of Mary. It's possible to use it in that way. So this phrase becomes difficult. What does Paul mean when he says, the husband of one wife? The man of one woman is another way that it could be written. The man of one woman, or the husband of one woman. So probably a better translation of this underlying Greek phrase is simply a one-woman man, or a one-wifed husband, or a one-womaned man. And it doesn't work out in English too well, so you get the point. It's difficult, but it's a one-woman man or a one-wifed husband. Now, is Paul insisting here then that an elder must be married? First question. Is he insisting that you must be a married man in order to be an elder? And the answer is probably not. A couple of reasons why. Number one, the context and Greek construction. Given those two, it is very likely that Paul is only referring here to the reputation of the man as it is seen in one of the most significant human relationships he will have. Okay, notice the context. What does the previous phrase say? He must be above reproach. So it seems likely then that Paul's simply continuing the thought. He must be above reproach. Oh, and this above reproach should show up in his most significant human relationship. One of the best ways to determine whether a man truly is above reproach is to examine his most significant and visible human relationship, his marriage. How is his reputation with his wife? What does he look like in terms of his relationship with his spouse, his wife? Notice that the context above reproach, as I said, seems to continue into this phrase. And we might even say that the list that follows it is also the same thing. What Paul is simply saying is the elder must be above reproach in his marriage, in this, in that, and so forth, as we'll see as we go along. So I think Paul is simply continuing the thought here. The construction of the Greek phrase itself emphasizes the word one rather than the word husband or wife. He must be a husband of one wife. The emphasis is not on the word husband. The emphasis is on the word one, okay, in the Greek anyways. So we might say it this way: the fidelity of a man to his wife, his oneness with her, is a great thermometer into whether a man is capable of spiritually guiding a church. We can learn a great deal about a man by how he relates to his wife, in other words, what his fidelity to her looks like. If he struggles in marriage or is unfaithful as a husband, he will probably carry those same weaknesses into his office as an elder. The human relationship that he has with his wife, which would be the most significant responsibility that he will carry under God on this earth, will probably carry over into how he relates to others in the church. There's a clear parallel between the two. So what Paul is doing here is instructing Timothy to use marriage as a lens through which to determine reputation. The microscope that we use is to ask about his family life, particularly his wife. But there's a second answer here in regards to this. Does Paul mean that a man must be married? And the second answer is no, given Paul's larger theology, as it is seen throughout his letters. Paul's larger theology is that it's very unlikely that Paul's insisting here that an elder must be married. It's not really his main point, because this would contradict Paul's own teaching in 1 Corinthians 7:7 and 7:32 to 35. Remember, never build your theology around one verse of Scripture. Okay? The totality of Scripture is where we build our theology. Timothy certainly would have been very familiar with Paul's views on singleness and marriage. How do I know? Because they spent a lot of time together. Right? Certainly, Timothy would have already understood Paul's views on marriage and singleness. All the time that they spent together certainly would have been the case. especially given how much time they spent together at Corinth, the very place that Paul wrote the words in 1 Corinthians 7:7. And you remember in those verses that Paul regarded singleness, like himself, as a blessing. He didn't consider singleness to be a crutch or a problem to be solved. He recognized that God does in fact ordain that some should remain single and not be married as he is, or as he was single. In fact, he says that the single man can concentrate all of his energies on the things of the Lord and not have to worry about taking out the trash. I didn't write that down there. In other words, he could focus his attention on the things of the gospel rather than having to worry about dealing with a wife. In other words, for Paul to insist that an elder must be married, but not, apostle doesn't mean to be married is highly inconsistent. Right, so he's clearly talking about all leadership in that case. However, Paul also understood the inherent desire of people to be married. He understood the inherent desire that all human beings possess to be married. Why do they possess this? Because it's a part of the very imago Dei that he created in us. When he created Adam, he said, "It is not good for the man to be alone." Adam did not have someone with him. And God looked upon him and said, it's not good for him to not have this relationship. It's a part of his very nature to have a partner, to have a helpmeet, to have someone who completes him. And so he created Eve for that purpose. So Paul understands that the inherent desire of people is to be married. So Paul includes this statement, I think, because he knows that the vast majority of men who would serve as elders would in fact be married. They would, just by virtue of the odds of it, right? They would be older and more mature, so the church would look to their marriages as evidence of the depth of their self-sacrificial nature. Which, by the way, according to Paul in Ephesians 5, is exactly what marriage is, a self-sacrificial relationship. Love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her. Paul says this is the reality. The vast majority of men will be married. Therefore, their marriages will give us a clue as to whether or not they are qualified to serve in the leadership capacity of a church. Paul has already said, as I said, that the elder must be a man of impeccable reputation, and this impeccable reputation shows up in his marriage. Therefore, an elder must be a man whose marriage demonstrates his impeccable reputation. What do you do with that? What do you do with that? Well, that becomes a sobering thought for the church to consider as a part of its examination of a potential elder. Do we see within this man a sense in which his commitment to his wife, his concept of marriage, his understanding of what it means to be the husband of one wife, what does it say about his reputation as an elder? And that's a sobering thing for the church to consider. But then in verse 2, part C, he must also be sober-minded and self-controlled. I'm going to put those two together. And the reason why is because I think they're virtually the same thing. Sober-minded means to be prudent, to be moderate. The word sober-minded literally means to be safe in mind. Safe in mind. The term self-controlled is a word here used differently than it is used in Galatians 5. In fact, this term self-controlled here that appears in this job description only appears here and in the same job description in Titus. It's the only place Paul ever uses this particular word. In Galatians 5, the different word means the ability to control one's passions and temptations. A self-controlled individual in terms of Galatians 5 is someone who possesses the fruit of the indwelling Holy Spirit to control their passions and their desires. To be able to say, I'm going to discipline myself against what I naturally desire. Okay? But that's not the way that Paul's using the word here. Oh, I suppose for an elder that would be true, don't you think? Because after all, if their reputation is what matters, then certainly a man whose reputation is impeccable is one who knows how to control his base desires. But that's not where Paul's really going here. What he means is the concept of a different kind of self-control, and the kind of self-control that he's thinking of here goes back to the previous word, safe in mind. This is a man who has the ability to control his own mind, to control his thinking, his ability to process information and control how he thinks about it. A sober-mindedness is this concept of being safe in mind. He's a man who thinks, but he's not easily dragged off by other thinking processes, by other thoughts and ideas that will come against him day by day, hour by hour, particularly in a culture like ours, which is infatuated with information. He is safe in mind. He has an ability to be self-controlled in his head. Question: what is the primary tool of the elder? What is the primary tool of the elder? And the answer, of course, is the Scriptures, but the Scriptures how? How does an elder use the tool? I mean, I could take this book and throw it at Belinda here, and how much effect is that going to have? Well, other than, waking her up. I mean, it's not going to have that much effect. What have I got to do with it? I have to take it and read it and explain it. That's the whole point. That's what an elder's doing with the tool. To do that, he has to have the ability to actually understand it. To glean its truths, to plumb its depths, and to be safe in doing that. You see, not plumbing it so that he can use it for his own power. Remember chapter 1? People who were teaching that which was opposed to orthodoxy in order to glean power. There will always be people that will use the word to make whatever point they want to make for whatever power trip they're on. There will always be people like that. The true elder, Paul says, is to be a man who is safe in mind. The congregation is able to say, that man takes out the Word of God and he preaches us to it. We learn from it, but we can trust his thinking in the process. That's what he means. You see, to understand this Bible takes a great deal of mental energy. It takes a great deal of mental energy to understand the Scriptures. Exegesis takes thought. It takes thinking. There's a lot of preachers, I think, who don't understand that concept. And that's why they don't do exegetical preaching. It's so much easier to preach just topical, humorous, illustration-filled sermons because, you can buy Holman's Book of Illustrations and make yourself look like a great and wonderful preacher. It doesn't take a whole lot of thought. Genuine biblical expository preaching takes energy. It takes mental energy. It takes a lot of thinking. It takes a lot of walking around in the church during the week and struggling with the text. Colin is laughing up here because he's caught me once or twice walking around here talking to myself. He sneaks in when no one's looking. How to apply the Word to varying levels of spiritual maturity amongst the people takes energy and thought. You have to think about what this thing says. So what Paul is saying is that the elder who is sober-minded thinks about the Word of God and how it applies to his people, especially how to make the hard stuff understandable. That takes work, doesn't it? It takes work to even describe what it means to be sober-minded. So Paul says an elder must be a man of impeccable reputation. That reputation must be visible in his marriage. That reputation must also be visible in how he focuses his mind upon that which matters in the church. But then Paul says he must also be respectable and hospitable. Respectable and hospitable. Again, I'll put those two words together because I think they're one and the same. Respectable means orderly, modest, proper. Literally, the word means decorous, polite, and restrained. So to be respectable is, as the word means, orderly. But hospitable means welcoming, friendly, showing warmth, particularly to strangers, or I suppose a sense of openness is a hospitality. Now this word is only used 3 times in the New Testament. Here, in Titus 1:8 and 1 Peter 4:9. Paul is probably, again, given the context, not using this term in the sense of someone who's good at throwing dinner parties. Certainly, that would be hospitable. Welcoming guests as a good host is certainly hospitable. But that's probably not what Paul means. He's talking within the context of the church. He's not talking necessarily about how the home life of the man would be, although there's a certain sense of that in that he's talking about the marriage of the man, so that's a home life issue. So there's certainly a sense in which he's referring to this as being a man who is open and hospitable. But Paul is probably, given the context, talking here about taking care of the needs of others. Our word hospital comes from the same root. A similar root word, taking care of bodily needs. Why do you go to hospital? You go to the hospital in order for your physical needs to be taken care of, right? So there's a sense in which this word is dealing with this idea of welcoming strangers and feeding them and so forth, okay? That would be the general idea of the word. But is Paul really talking here about the primary responsibility of a pastor being someone who's walking around taking care of people's actual physical material needs, as in a hospital? And probably not, again, given the context. For example, let's say that I'm having chest pains. I'm not. But let's say that I was. And I walked into the hospital and they wheeled me into a room there, and the doctor checked me over. I'm having the chest pains. And he decides that what I need for this particular problem is a cast on my left leg. So he puts a cast on my left leg and he sends me on my way. I mean, after all, he says, you have a slight fracture in your tibia on the left side, and so we're going to put a cast on that and take care of it, and he's going to send me out the door. Now, would I be satisfied with what I got? Would I be visiting that hospital again? Probably not, because the chest pains probably didn't get taken care of, right? No. I think what Paul is talking about here is the idea of real need, not perceived need. What is the real hospitality that Paul's talking about here? Embracing people and bringing them into the church and being involved with them, particularly in terms of the word, because he's going to come next to this idea of teaching. He's clearly talking about this idea of elders meeting needs, but not the needs they think they have, but the needs they actually have. The doctor assessed me and did find a problem and fixed it, supposedly, but he didn't really fix the real problem. He didn't fix the important one. He didn't fix the one that was really of very importance. And so an elder must be someone who is focused on the real needs of the people in the congregation. He's able to look past all of the surface level issues that are going on in the lives of people and see what their real problems are. You see, many churches in America today have that exactly flipped upside down, don't they? You walk into the church and their goal is to meet your perceived needs. Come to us if you're having a pain of some sort, and we'll help you with that. When the real need of the people coming to the church is their sinfulness, is their need for someone to bear this sin in themselves and to take them and give them hope, real hope, not just a Band-Aid on a bullet wound, but a real solution. Eternal needs, not just temporal needs. We have another group of men who are set aside for the purpose of temporal needs. We'll get to them when we get to verse 8. What the shepherds of the church are to be, the elders of the church are to be hospitable as one who welcomes people and puts them at ease, but is more concerned about their real needs than their perceived needs. See, one of the greatest dangers today of being an elder, and I give you Twitter as my primary example, one of the great dangers today is to stand and preach and to try to avoid offense. That's a danger. It's a danger. The danger is that we live today in the society of the perpetually offended, and so now, as people come into the church, they're bringing their offenses with them. Oh, and by the way, they're going to be scrutinizing everything the church does on the basis of what they think a church ought to be. And so they come to the church and they say, preach to me in such a way that I'm not offended, meet my temporal needs, and if you can do that successfully, then I'll hang around. But once you offend me, I'm out the door in any sort of way. The fact is, the matter is that even Jesus himself looked into the face of his own disciples as all of those who had ate the bread the day before that he had given them, as they all fled, he turned to them and said, does this offend you? And his implication was, it should. It should. The gospel is offensive. The gospel is offensive. MacArthur said it well to Shapiro the other day. He said, my job is to offend everybody. He said, that's my job. Because the very message that I'm preaching, the message of Christ, is offensive. It's offensive to people who believe that they can have whatever they want, as they want it, without ever having to capitulate to a holy God. That's what they want. So to truly preach the gospel of Jesus Christ is to stand before people and say to them, listen, you're welcome here, and we're glad that you're here. We're glad that you chose to come this morning. But be aware, the message of the gospel of Jesus is offensive. It requires repentance. It requires faith. That will offend you. That will offend you. But the elder is to be one who is concerned more about what really matters in your life than what you think matters in your life. Which leads then to the end of the verse when he says he must be able to teach. He must be able to teach. He must have an ability to instruct. That sounds like a synonym, right? He must have an aptitude of applied scholarship. He must be able to take concepts and make them understandable by others so that they learn. What is the primary characteristic of a good teacher? And the answer is, they have the ability to learn. The ability to learn. You cannot lead someone further than you yourself have gone. You cannot lead another person further than you have gone. And so therefore, to be a good teacher, you must be able to learn. You must be able to understand things. And then having an aptitude for learning, understanding deep concepts, communicating those concepts. And the key virtue of a teacher is patience. Patience. The key virtue of a good teacher is the art of repetition. Say it again, say it again, and again, and again, until people get it. Understand it, communicate it, and repeat it again and again and again. Again, what do most churches want in their pastor today? What do they really want from their pastor? What do they want their pastor to be? How many times have I said this? They want their pastor to be good administrators, good comforters, good counselors, good sympathizers. Yes, they got to be good speakers. They can't be boring. That would be the last thing we would want. But not necessarily good preachers, right? And most churches are not interested in good preachers. They're interested in good communicators. They want men who can speak in such a way that their sermons are interesting. Right? Keep me interested, Pastor. Throw in a humorous anecdote every once in a while to keep me on my toes. Right? That's good preaching in our day. In fact, there are some men who become so good at it that their entire sermon is nothing more than one long humorous illustration from beginning to end. All of these things are good. Being good administrators, comforters, counselors, etc. These are good. But there's an important axiom to remember. When it comes to the office of elder, never, ever let the good crowd out the best. Never let the good crowd out the best. Yes, it is good for an elder to be a good administrator, a good speaker, a good counselor, all those kinds of things. There are many things that are good. And they're important, yes. But never at the expense of what is best for us. What do we need? What do we really need when we gather together on Sunday morning and we sit here in this place and endure an hour and a half? What is it that we really, what is the best for us? And here's the point that Paul is making here. Able to teach. The primary job of an elder is to teach. All other functions of his job, no matter how important they might be, pale beside the awesome responsibility he has to teach his people the whole counsel of God. Yes, people will chafe against this. People will chafe against good teaching. They'll sit there and go, oh, this guy's boring. I mean, every week, 1 Timothy. Give me something else, preacher. They will chafe against it. But remember the context here. Who's Paul writing to? He's writing to a church that is struggling with heterodoxy. What do they need? They need men who will stand up and say, whoa, 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 whoa. I know Joe over here is teaching this and that, but he's wrong. Here's what the Bible truly says. This is what you really need, and this is what's important. Focus your attention in the right place. You see it? Paul's not suggesting that the elder should be boring, but Paul is suggesting that the elder should be a man whose primary concern is for the spiritual life of his congregation. Because the life of the church is at stake. The life of the people in the church are at stake. Their eternal destinies are at stake. I don't think there's that many people that really understand that today. You know what I mean? They don't really realize the connection between what's going on in their local church on Sunday morning and their eternal destiny. They don't really make that connection so much anymore. They don't really think about what they're doing on Sunday morning being so important to their life, their reality, their spiritual existence, and the danger. I mean, why is it that God established a Sabbath day for us to get together every single week? Because we need it. Because we need a day of rest. We need a day to put aside all of the cares and concerns of this world, to gather together as the people of God and come under His Word and be reminded again. I know it's only been 168 hours, but to be reminded again, this is who this God is and this is what He has done. And we cannot afford to miss one. We cannot afford to miss one. We're putting our lives at risk. So, in summary of just, 2 verses? Paul says, the true reputation of an elder is not determined by his community relationships or the strength of his marriage, but by his unwavering passion to advance the spiritual well-being of his flock through the God-ordained means of teachings. These other personal matters are important. It's important that the elder have a good reputation because no one's going to listen to his teaching if he's beating his wife. Right? Or they shouldn't. And no one's going to pay attention to the man if he's not sober-minded, if he's wandering off to everything imaginable under the sun. Who's going to pay attention to him? No one's going to pay attention to him if he's a mean ogre, gruff sort and not hospitable. No one's going to pay attention to the teaching. Notice where Paul's going. Paul's saying, listen, if you want to put a man into eldership, make sure that that man has all of these kinds of things, an impeccable reputation, a good marriage, and so forth, in order that the people of God will be willing to submit themselves to his teachings. That's what we don't want to derail, is whether or not those who are doing this work are leading the people in the things that matter the most. Paul's not done, of course. He has more to say. And he starts in verse 3 with some nots, okay? So he starts talking about a few things we're not supposed to be. And we'll get to those next Sunday, Lord willing. But let us pause and consider and remind ourselves as a congregation, these are the things you must insist upon from your elders. Do not assume it. Demand it. Demand it.